Have you ever wondered if Grey's Anatomy is real? Well, today we're bringing to you sex in the workplace, and that's next on Employment Law After Hours.
Also, welcome back, Amanda.
Thanks for having me.
For arguably the steamiest episode that we have.
All right, so yes, Is healthcare like Grey's Anatomy? I'm so glad we have wine for this episode because this is going to be an uncomfortable one with, unfortunately, a lot of good stories.
Why don't we just kick it off then? Let's use a story to kind of illustrate, the issues we're going to discuss, being ranging from harassment to potential criminal liability to obviously ethic liability with employee sex at work. So why don't you give us some to get that started?
Sure. So I can probably break these stories up or examples up into two categories: employee and employee with employee sex and employee with patient sex.
Okay.
So let's start with employee to employee sex.
All right, we'll start with the boring one. Okay.
Well, it can still be a little bit like Grey's Anatomy, right? Sure. So, you know, the physicians in the on-call room. I had that scenario a few months ago.
Wait, so you had a physician and a nurse or other employee having sexual relations in an on-call room?
Yes.
It's literally what you see on TV.
It is. It's not all the time, but it is.
Sure.
And so that can be disruptive to the workplace. Mm-hmm. The workplace is for work.
What happens when you get a call saying, hey, I have a physician or I have another employee who's having sex with another employee in the workplace?
I always say, well, what is your policy, right? Do you have a policy on this?
And hopefully they do.
Hopefully they do. And then, the first question I ask, or the second question I ask after do you have a policy is, do we have a supervisor having sex with a supervisee? Because that can be an automatic quid pro quo situation. That is more in your wheelhouse as an employment lawyer. And I would say that in healthcare, we see a lot more of that supervisor-supervisee. Mm-hmm. So, the example that I gave in the on-call room was physician to physician. But we see a lot of physician and nurse, physician and office manager. As corny as it is, it happens. Yeah. And the opportunity is there because they work long hours and facilities that have beds and rooms that, rooms that aren't being used and doors that lock. And, it's unfortunate, but it happens.
It starts to beg the question about consent and whatnot. If you've got a supervising physician with someone who would fall below them in the ranks, can that person really consent to whatever is happening? Or even if they are consenting, can that come back to bite you if, they've got some sort of disciplinary action?
Well, Monica, that's a great point. So when you're talking about consent, obviously, if you truly have a consent issue with employee to employee, encourage, one of those employees, whoever's affected, to definitely be calling law enforcement to investigate a consent issue. If you're talking about a consensual employee to employee relationship, in those cases, definitely be consulting your harassment policies of your handbook. You need to conduct that investigation and encourage that subordinate employee and let them know that, hey, we're not going to be disciplining you, punishing you for coming forward because obviously this implicates, sexual harassment policies.
So moving on to some steamier examples. Sure. So we have a provider or an employee having sex with a patient. And it happens.
Oh, that's a whole new level.
It is a whole new level. And it's a whole different analysis, right? Mm-hmm. So it could be problematic when you've got a licensed individual having a sexual relationship with a patient where they have maybe a fiduciary duty or some kind of duty under state law to that person that's owed to that person. And so we have to look at state licensure laws to see, can the relationship even occur? And that's outside of your employment, policies. So we could be implicating the licensure rules here. But I've got plenty of examples of licensed individuals, mostly physicians, not to pick on the physicians, but mostly physicians having sex with patients.
All right, let's hear one.
Okay. So obviously just having the good old-fashioned consensual sexual relationship with the patient.
Sure. So, and as you said, that implicates potential licensure issues, as well as I'm hoping most of your hospital employer clients have policies that say, hey, physicians, you can't have sex with your patients.
You'd hope.
You'd hope. And if it's a good old-fashioned consensual relationship, they may want to consider not having a physician-patient relationship, just having a consensual, relationship that's outside of the workplace. And you definitely do not want them to be having sexual relations in the workplace. It has to happen outside of the workplace.
There we go. All right, so those are the easy cases. Do they get worse from there?
Of course they get worse, Brian. Of course they get worse. So then you have the good old quid pro quo. Okay? So it's the physician having sex with the patient, but it's a quid pro quo situation where I am not going to treat you as a physician unless we have sexual relations.
Wow.
Or I'm not going to give you the prescription for the narcotics unless we have sexual relations.
Sure.
Or, even worse, I am not going to treat I'm a pediatrician, I'm not going to treat your child or perform surgery on your child unless we have sexual relations. So there are different gradations, but it's quid pro quo, and that is definitely going to be a licensure violation.
Sure. And again, this doesn't really cross the realm into employment unless you have a policy. So make sure you have a policy that, is addressing sex with outside individuals.
So when we get into examples of quid pro quo, and I'm not going to prescribe you narcotics unless you have sexual relations with me, then we get into not only is it quid pro quo, but then it's an impairment issue, and do we have the capacity to consent?
Yes.
And so if the individual is under the influence of drugs, do they have the capacity to consent? And are these individuals being taken advantage of?
Sure.
And we've had plenty of cases. Typically, those rise to the level of criminal charges being filed. And they're very unfortunate cases because it's a very vulnerable population.
You don't want a situation where someone's in the emergency room kind of coming down or detoxing and then having their doctor coming up to them and say, hey, I'll give you, skim some off the top, looking back to that episode number 1, skim some off the top, give it to you if you have sexual relations with me. I mean, that's just an absolute horrible situation, which again is going to implicate licensure rules as well as maybe state law. But again, it's not going to cross that realm into your jurisdiction as an employer unless you have that policy or otherwise addressing that as a workplace misconduct and then, leading to termination.
And so you bring up that example, Brian, of, a physician going up to a patient and saying, hey, I'll give you drugs in exchange for sex. I've had it happen in the physician office. So you've got to have sex with me, or or there's molestation or,
Sure.
Improper touching in exchange for that prescription. I've had a physician actually have sex with drug-addicted prostitutes in the hospital.
Wow.
And these were people that were not they were not able to consent. They did not have capacity.
Sure.
Right.
And, he was definitely taking advantage of the situation. And so, unfortunately, I mean, I've seen, a lot of very unfortunate situations.
Have you ever had a situation where you've had a physician or another employee of the hospital having sex at the hospital, but not, say, with an employee or a patient of the hospital?
Ooh, that's a good question. So those are the situations where sex is occurring outside of the workplace and then it ekes into the workplace, right? So I've had physicians that have been on, Tinder or whatever dating app, right? I don't know all these apps, but you've got physicians that go out on these dating apps and they meet someone and it's a consensual relationship and it just goes south, and then wouldn't you know, she or he shows up at the workplace and, starts talking to patients, starts talking to other employees, puts things on the website, on the reviews, and could even, file complaints with the licensure board. So you want to make sure that if you are a licensed individual and you are on these dating apps, that you're being very careful about keeping your personal life personal and not letting it bleed over into the workplace.
We're trying to protect you as the employer from liability, both in civil court and from having to deal with licensure issues, as well as we're trying to protect your employees and your patients as well. I think Amanda said it great. As a hospital system or as a healthcare employer, your first responsibility is to your patients.
So is it like Grey's Anatomy? A little bit. But as we talk about some of these situations, we do have some serious legal implications, but then also some, serious issues that we need to deal with on the employer side.
So I think that's all we have for you today on Employment Law After Hours. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you stay tuned for our 5th and final episode of this series on Deviance. So come and do it in quickly. So definitely hit that subscribe button so you don't forget to see that, and we'll see you next time.